a recognition of the political challenges that the SSR faces, particularly now that Africa has developed its own SSR framework that tries very delicately to balance global best practice and African peculiarities. It seems like a difficult act of synthesis for two reasons. The first reason is that, fortunately or not, a lot of African constituencies, and certainly heads of state, tend to identify SSR with a foreign concept, and there is a tremendous political pushback on that basis. Now, is SSR actually a foreign concept? My own response to that situation is that, in fact, the genesis of SSR, the whole experiential basis, both the historical events and the motive forces that led to the evolution of SSR as a concept, originated in the southern countries, and specifically in Africa and Latin America, where there were these locally grounded struggles to transform and to reshape security institutions as a cornerstone of authoritarian dispensations. Now, clearly these struggles were configured in very localized ways, quite different within Latin America than generally in Africa, and also different from regions within Latin America and regions within Africa. But the basic idea was that a compendium of experiences were developed that led to this whole notion of the absolute necessity, if you're going to reconfigure the very nature of politics and to deepen prospects for democracy, that you had to get hold of this leviathan that they call the security sector, the security institutions. That's point number one. Point number two is that in the middle to late 90s, when the European nations, led by the United Kingdom, began to struggle toward the conceptualization of what later became SSR, that a lot of the intellectual force for that came from Africans, and I'm not embarrassed to say, including myself, but also quite a few of the African colleagues who subsequently came together to form the African Security Sector Network. Inspired both by our own research experiences, but also by the concurrent experiences of that time of the security sector transformation initiatives in South Africa. And it's interesting that, in fact, a lot of the mantra of later SSR, the fact that it had to be participatory, it had to be consultative, all of these notions had their precedence in the South African experience. And we were then involved very much from 1998 to 1999, beginning with the defense budgeting workshop that DFID put together in London, which led to a broader conceptualization, which people basically said, the problem is not the whole new liberal focus on excessive public spending, particularly on security and so on and so forth, but a whole set of broader, more intricate, more intractable dynamics that have to do fundamentally with the nature of power relations and so on. So we were ourselves at the very center of the development of what eventually turned out to be the SSR paradigm. We were very much involved in, and so was Malika, as I recall, the OECD guidelines. We did the background research, authored some of the chapters. We were very much involved in the subsequent technical handbook, a lot of which were written by third world Southern scholars and so on. Now, particular form that once this went through the policy mill of the European countries, it assumed a somewhat different character and became part of the policy complexion that was developing in response, founded substantially on neoliberal principles and so on, but increasingly with a grafting of democratic principles, concepts of democratic control, governance, and so on. These were accretions, if you want to call it that way. This was an incremental enlargement of the discourse, and it became almost a growth monster, increasingly diffuse, every day it acquires this, and then this was turned around and presented to Africans as yet another policy response to our, our grave and comprehensive and intractable crisis. So from that point of view, this concept, when I say was appropriated and Europeanized, that was it. And unfortunately, what that means is that the African audiences, the African consumers of this refurbished, Europeanized product, of course, kicked against it and said, we don't like this thing, because it's the latest magic solution, the latest snake oil, invented by the North for the South. And we've tried to say that actually the origins of this were African experiences. This is our own, if you wish, intellectual, shall I say, patrimony. I know that sounds gendered, and that, we have to sort, if you wish, the wheat from the chaff, So this synthesis of global best practice, for which we ourselves were partly responsible, and a good deal of it referred, for instance, to the South African experience, but also to Latin American experiences. Now the lineage was lost because there was very little effort in the process of developing SSR to refer it back to these historical experiences, okay? To refer it back or to root it in the intricate and painful analytical research that had been done previously to demonstrate and at the same time to drive and to learn from these grounded political struggles for democracy. The linkages were things like development and so on and so forth. That was European. We never bothered to link it to development. We linked it to class hegemony. We linked it to imperialism. All of the single process was neatly edited out of the narrative. And what came back to us was this nicely technicist, framework that made it sound as if, all you had to do was adopt SSR. And then, many of the associations of SSR go back to the modernization paradigm of the 1960s, what you called in those days institutional transfer. So you tend to find that a lot of this state building, earlier notions of the state building thing, had these Weberian overtones, ideal typic institutions, rational bureaucracy, and things like this, and all you needed to do was to get these, insolent and intractable and entirely misconceived third world nationalist liberation movements and so on, former socialistic movements, to adopt the voice of reason and the structures of rationality. SSR was all of this reawakened and applied to the security sector. So it means that when you allude, as we've done with the AU policy framework, to the whole matter of global best practice, this global best practice is itself, if you wish, the product of a certain mutation of African experiences. It's the product of a certain Europeanization, a certain globalization, a particular type of policy refinement, if you wish, that kind of thing. Now, the interesting thing, actually more challenging, is the bit about African specificities. So what is the real economy of security and security provisioning in an African context? So if we say that we're going to reform it, what is it that we need? Now, there are these suggestive paragraphs about, the absolute relevance of customary, non-state, informal, village-level security and justice organs, which are part of the African landscape, but which are either completely edited out of the SSR discourse or acknowledged only in passing in ways that are entirely supercilious. So here in the AU policy framework, the idea is to take that seriously and to make that inform, The problem is that, we've done very little research on stuff like that, A lot of it tends to just dismiss this as, elements of, the chaos, beyond the boundaries of modernization and so on. Proper state building means that it's the state that, provides these things. Now, there's a grudging acknowledgement that this whole historic system, linear, comfortable, homogenized conception of state building actually doesn't really conform to reality. And in any event, however feasible as a long-term project, it's certainly not feasible as a short-term project. You're not going to get European-type states, duly legitimated, competent, fully capacitated in Africa anytime in the visible future. So there's now a grudging acknowledgement that we need to look at a more open-ended paradigm that takes on board these elements of the African experience. Okay, so that's good. The problem is that we ourselves have a poor understanding of it. But more dangerously, SSR itself has very little interest and very little capacity and very little room for research. That grounded, painstaking research that illuminates, the real nature of forces at the grassroots level and so on. So the problem that faces us is to be able to vindicate, in terms of understanding and in terms of including it in programming, the fundamental realities of our own African context. But okay, so part of the larger point that I've also made in the past is that you tend, therefore, because of this disrespect or this tendency to ignore research and to ignore history, you see very little connection between SSR formulations and the earlier security sector research, what we used to call civil military relations and so on. And you also tend to see a disjunction between actors, in these two, in the creation or construction of these two discourses. A lot of the people that work on civil military relations, very richly in the context of Latin America, and I don't by this mean only Latin Americans, including American scholars who worked in this area and so on. You find that they did not make the crossover to SSR. Some of us did, including perhaps somewhat dubiously myself, and some of my key colleagues and so on. But we've always been the critical edge of SSR. That SSR is really fundamentally innocent. It's both complacent and all right. Well, it's only but it's not underpinned by political analysis. it has a poor understanding of regimes and power structures, particularly informal power structures. Okay, and part of the reason is simply this disconnect between the previous tradition of grounded, evidence-based, painful research, which was not palatable to the global power structure, because it was encased in broader analysis of global inequalities, global power structures, imperialism, capitalism, capitalistic exploitation, and so on and so forth. And you won't see a hint of any of that stuff in the SSR discourse. So it means that it's, it's not to say that there isn't a lot that is not positive about SSR. They attend to, combine together elements of security, public safety, of justice, of development, of inclusiveness, of gender sensitivity, and so on. There's a lot of very positive elements there, but the reality is that this lacks really a serious engagement both with history and with the play of structures. Myself, as I'm sure you do, because you were part of all of this as well, a real tremendous sense of loss at the dissolution of the previous platforms, the GFN, SSR, and the Global Consortium, and things like this. Now, ASSN is a much narrower remit. It's training and education and so on, but almost in spite of itself. I mean, in the process of the discussions and so on, really quite positive exchange of experiences across the South emerges. Obviously this was not necessarily a fundamental aspect of the agenda, but it does show really both the commonalities and the divergences of certain experiences, and really the need to create a more horizontal set of partnerships that do not necessarily replicate the more vertical north-south experiences. And really, I think that is our own feeling. I mean, you cannot constantly be griping about the North and them and them and them. I mean, we are sufficiently masters of our own fate that we should be able to link up, with researchers in Latin America, with researchers across Asia, and so on. Now, we ourselves are a network, and putting together an African network is sufficiently challenging. With the previous platforms, and now, of course, with ASSN, we're going a step beyond that. The Global Facilitation Network and also the Global Consortium was actually a network of networks, and there's a possibility that ASSN too might gain some of that element. And what it showed in this discussion here is that even the approach to what you call education and training, I mean, when you compare the Brazilian example, homegrown, systematic, multi-dimensional, sustainable with real intellectual and policy content, compare that with what has been passing for training and education in much of Africa, under foreign sponsorship, one-offs, a lot of the work itself and the capacity is developed abroad. The institutions themselves that sponsor these things abroad, and it's a completely different kettle of fish. Now, obviously, we did not get quite the same instruction from the Asian presentations because, again, things are configured differently. But it also gives you a good impression of the linkage between intellectual work, analysis, research, and political activism. That is promoted by the Asian institutions, including the RCSS. So it means that for us in Africa, we really need to diverge from the dominant paradigm of so-called capacity building, which is largely sponsored by outsiders, which, as I say, has very little real contextual relevance, partly because, as I said, when we start talking about local stuff, a lot of the programming, a lot of the curriculum is generic. And it was very interesting that the Rwandan colleague from the Rwanda Peace Academy actually alluded to this, but ended up saying, well, their intention is to feed their homegrown and home experiences into their educational thing, but they haven't been able to do it. And right now, it's still the generic thing. It says, it described it colorfully as an uncustomized curriculum, which I thought really said it very nicely. So that is the challenge. We have to be much more self-driven. And this whole notion of constantly looking outside for capacity and so on. And I think Tom Hamilton Bailey was quite right when he said that outside capacity is precisely what is short-circuit, a recognition of local capacity, which is there, but which is constantly being submerged under a volley of imported consultancies and so on. So what that means is that, we basically have to get our own house in order, and I'm hoping that the AU framework, if we can begin to get the politics of it right, and it's always the politics of it, may help us to get over some of these, essentially, disabilities.